Last night in Austin and Dallas, police broke up protests in the streets over the federal crackdown on immigration. They followed mostly peaceful protests here in Houston and San Antonio, and days of protests and violence in L.A. I'm Craig Cohen. Today on Houston Matters, how far protesters' First Amendment rights to speech and assembly should extend. We discuss that and other recent First Amendment tests and what they mean for us here in Houston.
Houston Matters with Craig Cohen is a production of Houston Public Media with support from Baylor College of Medicine.
Also this hour, more rain's on the way this week. We'll check in with Houston Chronicle meteorologist Justin Ballard. Also, amid shifting political and economic winds, is transportation equity over? We discuss with Robin Holzer, the new head of Link Houston, formerly with Bike Houston. We'll start with a news update from NPR and News 88.7. Stay with us. This is Houston Matters. I'm Craig Cohen. Good morning. Coming up this hour, protests over immigration policy in Dallas and Austin last night resulted in some arrests. We'll discuss whether any First Amendment rights are being infringed on during such protests nationwide and explore other ways the First Amendment's being tested these days. Also, amid shifting political and economic winds, is transportation equity over? We discuss. But let's save the weather metaphors for a bit later and start with some actual weather. Houston Chronicle meteorologist Justin Ballard's here to talk over what could be shaping up to be a very rainy week. Justin, good morning.
Good morning.
The weather app on my phone, which never lies, says...
I'll reserve judgment.
You should.
For now.
Because it says no rain today, but solid chances every day thereafter for the next week. Is it right?
It's not right, but it's right to the extent that, we've got solid chances throughout the rest of the week for rain, but we do have the chance for rain and storms today.
Why would it not pick up on that?
Well, this pattern that we're in is notoriously difficult for our forecast models, which all of our apps rely on, right? Which is why we tell folks to get your forecast from a person, a real-life human,
right?
A real-life meteorologist, and don't solely rely on those apps. But they do pull from those models. Those models have a hard time with this kind of pattern that we're in. So I know I've been kind of keeping an eye on a line of storms that have been moving out of the Panhandle through Hill Country. Right now, they're right along the I-35 corridor. They're going to be heading towards the I-45 corridor and Houston later on today. So likely weakened.
What is this pattern, and why is it so difficult to predict?
If you recall, this weekend was extremely hot. We had a ridge of high pressure, a heat dome, if you will, that was kind of parked on top of us, bringing us temperatures well above what we normally see, which is not cool for this time of year. 92, 93, that's kind of the average high. But that heat ridge has kind of shifted off to our south and west, and that's really opened us up to that kind of northwesterly flow where thunderstorms really get going in the panhandle of Texas, wrong state, panhandle of Texas and New Mexico, and they move through the entire state because of that northwest flow. So we're kind of downstream from where those thunderstorms got going yesterday afternoon in the panhandle.
So I recall this from past conversations that when we have that so-called heat dome overhead, it kind of keeps storms at bay. It's kind of like late last week we were talking on this show about the Saharan dust that was moving in and how that has a tendency to keep tropical storms from developing in the Gulf.
Absolutely.
Those are
connected
that's
in a way.
And that's fine in both cases with me. I'm actually not so sad that the heat dome is left, though, because we could probably use a little rain, right?
We could, especially, you think about June, July is when we start drying out, and then August sometimes is really hit or miss with rainfall here. The last two Augusts that I've been here have been incredibly dry. So if we can get that rain, kind of front load the early summer months with rain, I think we're in a good position as long as that rain doesn't come too much at one time.
We're not necessarily in the heart of hurricane season yet, just at the beginning of it, but in light of pop-up storms the last couple of days and rain in the forecast off and on through the week, this would seem, I think, to be a good time to remind everyone that we don't need a tropical storm to see damage done here.
No, absolutely not. There's been numerous occasions here in Southeast Texas, just since I've been here, and it's only been 2 years, where you've had thunderstorm complexes that move through that cause tons of damage. So you don't need a tropical storm, you don't need a hurricane, you just need Houston weather.
Heck, we saw some street flooding just a few days
ago.
Yeah. Do these chances of rain have any impact on the kind of heat that we will see this week?
It does. So the fact that we've got, 40, 60, 70, 80% chances of rain through the next 4 days, 3 or 4 days, really will keep temperatures lower low 90s, which is about close to where we should be for this time of the year. We're not necessarily talking about, 85 and below, but we're talking, slightly less hot than what we had over the weekend. It was 98 degrees on Sunday at Bush Intercontinental.
I noticed. So summarize for us. When are our best chances for rain and what should we gear up for the rest of this week?
Today, the best chance for rain is through the afternoon. We're talking between 2 o'clock and about 5, 6 o'clock this evening. So that evening commute could certainly be slowed down. Going into tomorrow, Wednesday, Thursday, into Friday, afternoon rain chances are really going to be highest, but it's really something that I want y'all all to kind of keep an eye on, each and every day, because that pattern, again, is notoriously tricky for these forecast models to pick up more than 12 to 24 hours out.
Justin Ballard is a meteorologist with the Houston Chronicle. Justin, thank you very much.
Thanks for having me.
And up next, protests in Dallas and Austin last night led to some arrests. It's also led to questions about First Amendment rights to assembly. We'll clarify what's protected and what's not and discuss how the First Amendment's being tested these days. Stick around as Houston Matters continues. This is Houston Matters. I'm Craig Cohen. Last night in Austin and Dallas, police broke up protests in the streets over the federal crackdown on immigration. That's what it sounded like near the Margaret Hunt Hill Bridge in Dallas Monday night. The crowd there was ordered to disperse around 11 o'clock or face being arrested. Governor Abbott says more than a dozen people were arrested in Austin during a protest organized in solidarity with the recent immigration protests in Los Angeles.
You are ordered to disperse out of the area immediately to the north on San Jack. If you do not disperse, you may be subject to arrest and/or less legal action.
Police warning in Austin last night. Sunday saw mostly peaceful protests here in Houston and in San Antonio, but it all comes on the tail end of days of protests and violence in Los Angeles. To some, protesters crossed a line beyond their First Amendment protection of free assembly. To others, police stepped over the line to quell those protests at the expense of the protesters' First Amendment rights. When it comes to free assembly and free speech and free exercise of religion and freedom of the press, those First Amendment constitutional protections are routinely tested in legislatures, courts, and yes, in the general public. But how much more are their boundaries being tested these days? By whom? And what does it all mean for us here in Houston? To discuss, we're joined now by University of Houston law professor Emily Berman from the UH Law Center. Emily Berman, good morning.
Good morning.
And as we chat, we welcome you to our conversation with questions and comments about the ways in which the First Amendment's being tested these days and what it means for us here in Houston. You can call or text us at 713-440-8870. You can email talk@houstonmatters.org. Is this actually coming up a lot more, or is it just that some perceive it that way?
I think it is coming up a lot more in many ways. Since the beginning of this administration, we've seen the administration take many actions designed to either retaliate against speech that they don't like or to suppress speech that they don't want to hear. So everything from, deporting immigrant students because they were involved in pro-Palestinian demonstrations to targeting law firms because of the clients that they have championed. All of those types of measures have been challenged in the courts. And so we're seeing a lot more out there about, what are the limits of what the government can do in response to speech that they don't like.
All right, so let's talk about the First Amendment a little bit, and I think we can break it down in three ways. There's what it says, there's what it means, and then there's also how is that being interpreted differently as you go year to year, month to month, even day to day these days. So let's start with the text itself. What does it actually say?
So the First Amendment has essentially three separate important clauses. One, it says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. And that's where we get our freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of assembly, freedom to protest. All of that comes in the First Amendment speech clause. Then there are also two religion clauses in the First Amendment. The free exercise clause that says the government can't prevent anyone from exercising their religion. And then what's known as the Establishment Clause, which says the government can't endorse or adopt any particular religion. So each of those has been sort of much in the news of late, and different people have very different views about what those protect and what their limits are.
Well, let's start with those first 5 words. Congress shall make no law. Does that mean the executive branch is free to infringe on Americans' First Amendment rights?
Well, it's sort of the question is, what are those rights, given that the constitutional text says Congress shall make no law? Most people, I think, Justice Black is famously one of the only people who has said that they believe we should take those words literally, that Congress shall make no law. But most people say there have to be reasonable limits on what people can say. So you can march in the streets and say that you object to government policies, but you can't break into the governor's mansion to tell the governor in his face that you object with policies. So what are often described as time, place, or manner restrictions are mundane, and the courts have said those are perfectly acceptable. So the government can place limits on where do you protest. You can't protest perhaps in residential neighborhoods after 10 p.m. using a loudspeaker. So those sorts of things that talk about how you protest, where you protest, those are relatively uncontroversial. What becomes problematic is when government rules start to determine what the rules are based on the content of speech. So what is it you're saying? What viewpoint are you expressing? Those are the things that the government can't come in and dictate.
Does this only extend to the federal government, or does it extend to the states?
So it extends to both. In addition to the federal government's, the federal Constitution's First Amendment, which it does apply to the federal government, also applies now, didn't always, but now applies to the states. Most state constitutions also include some form of free speech or free expression and freedom of religion as well.
Getting back to free assembly on the socials, I've certainly come across some who have been characterizing reaction to the protests of recent days as a double standard, that the same voices decrying violence and calling protests riots were the ones defending, for instance, the violent protests at the Capitol on January 6, 2021. Do they have a point?
In my view, they do. I think it's hard to characterize what happened on January 6th as anything other than violence. The amount of violence going on in LA, is subject, as you mentioned, to some debate. I think no one would argue that violence is protected. That form of protest is not protected by the First Amendment, and I think most people would say violence is impermissible and should be punished. And I think that should hold true regardless of the cause for which you are engaging in violence, whether that's, because you're objecting to immigration policy or because you're upset about the outcome of an election.
We have an email here from Justin who's pointing out the president specifically pardoning the folks that participated in the January 6 rioters and that were convicted of crimes in the process of it. And Justin calls it hypocrisy. It may be, you may interpret it as hypocrisy, but that's different from what is constitutionally protected and what's not, right?
Well, certainly the president is entitled to pardon whoever he likes, and that's another, right in the Constitution for the president. So it may be hypocritical, but it doesn't mean that the violence in LA is permissible or impermissible just because of violence elsewhere. I think we need to, it's sort of like those time, place, and manner regulations. We need to be treating the behavior the same regardless of the position that is being advocated.
Is it clear in the letter of the law, whether we're talking about the First Amendment of the Constitution or any other laws in the books, where the line legally is when it comes to where and how Americans are free to assemble?
Yeah, so the line is very protective of speech and expression, more so in the United States than anywhere else in the world. We're a real outlier in this respect. And the constitutional test actually says you can't punish speech unless that speech is both intended to and likely to cause imminent lawless action. So it has to be designed to create immediate violence or riots or some other form of lawlessness. And it has to be likely to have that effect. Absent that, people are free to say what they want to say, and the government can't punish them for it.
This is Houston Matters. I'm Craig Cohen. We're discussing the First Amendment to the Constitution, what it says, what it means, how it's interpreted, and how we're seeing those lines tested these days. We welcome your questions and comments. You can call or text us at 713-440-8870. You can email us at talk@houstonmatters.org. Are there any upcoming federal court cases that are looking into how the First Amendment's free speech protections may be challenged, where those lines are?
So there's one case that we're waiting for. It's actually a case out of Texas called Free Speech Coalition versus Paxton, where the question is, how should courts analyze rules limiting access by age to certain websites, and in particular sexually explicit websites? And this has been a frequent sort of flashpoint under the First Amendment, because there's a balance to be had of you want to be able to protect minors from speech that is harmful to them without going so far as to deny access to people who are entitled to see that particular content. And so the Fifth Circuit said we should be much more lenient in allowing the government to impose these age restrictions than we are in most other areas of the First Amendment. And so the question at the Supreme Court is, what is the standard of review? How good of a reason does the government have to impose these age restrictions? And so that's one of the cases we're waiting for.
Are there other clear limits to speech that we haven't discussed yet?
I think there are a few categories of speech that are not protected. So in addition to the incitement of violence that I mentioned before, things that are true threats that someone would interpret as a threat and are intended to be threatening, that's not protected. Defamation is speech that is not protected. Some commercial speech, like advertising, is slightly less protected than speech, say, about political issues. So there are a handful of categories of speech that we say are not valuable enough for us to want to protect under the First Amendment, but the speech that is protected is very broadly protected.
You mentioned that one case before the Supreme Court is based out of Texas. We come up a lot in Supreme Court cases involving not just the First Amendment, but just about everything you can think of. Why is that?
It's interesting you say that. A colleague and I actually taught a writing seminar called Texas versus the United States, calling attention to the fact that so much of our constitutional doctrine comes out of cases arising in Texas. And I think there are a few reasons for that. One is that in recent years, recent administrations have been in Texas quite aggressive about challenging federal policies that they object to. And often that will come on constitutional grounds. So part of it is that. I think part of it is also, Texas likes to do things Texas's way, and doesn't like to be dictated to by, federal law or federal officials, and so are happy to be out there sort of in front, pushing the law in ways that they would like to see it move.
I want to get to an example of that in just a couple of minutes, but let's take a call. We have Debbie on the line from Pearland. Debbie, what's your question or comment?
Good morning. Thank you for letting me speak. I am so grateful to live in a country that gives us the freedom of speech, where we cannot be thrown into prison or jail because of our opinion. But my greatest concern is that now, of course, I agree that violence or inciting people to violence is not a good thing, but our society in general is using the freedom of speech to complain, but without giving a solution to our problems. Our society has gotten to the point where we are not coming up with good ideas to say, this is wrong, but can't we do that?
All right. Thank you for the call and for the comment. Hard to argue with that point.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of the primary characteristics of our current political moment is that there's sort of extreme views or strongly held views on each side, and not a lot of willingness to compromise or try to work through what might be the solutions. And I think we're seeing the results of that unwillingness to compromise in the streets today.
Isaac asks, do you concede there's a difference between constitutional and morally correct? And Isaac says, when protesting technically constitutional state-sanctioned violence, don't citizens have an obligation to act unconstitutionally for the greater good of society?
Well, there's certainly the concept of civil disobedience and the idea of violating a law in order to call attention to the injustice of that law. And, we saw that a lot during the civil rights movement. We see that when, for example, environmentalists chain themselves to trees that are going to be cut down. And I think civil disobedience plays an important role in shaping the dialogue around speech and around policy and what should be permitted and what is impermissible. But I think what comes along with the decision to engage in civil disobedience is you have to be then willing to pay the consequences of that civil disobedience. And, it's why we have Martin Luther King's letter from a Birmingham jail, because he engaged in civil disobedience. He was put in jail and wrote, one of the more influential civil rights statements that we have from that position.
Let's come back to Texas and how we have this tendency to present test cases for the Supreme Court to decide. State lawmakers in Austin just this session passed a bill to place the 10 Commandments in every public school classroom in the state. Students are required to attend school. Many do not subscribe to the specific text that of the 10 Commandments that this bill calls for. Does that sound to you like a clear violation of the First Amendment protection from state-sponsored religion?
It does to me. I think if you are holding out religious precepts in a place where people don't have the option not to be exposed to them, and there are no alternative religious precepts being offered, that seems to me a pretty clear violation, not just of the spirit of the Establishment Clause, but also the way it's been interpreted. Listeners might remember a very high-profile case also out of Texas about the 10 Commandments and the monument that is on the grounds of the Capitol. And one of the things that the court said there is that monument is there amongst monuments to many other things, and it is part of a broader display of sort of cultural and legal heritage of Texas and the people of Texas. And because it's part of that broader display, it's not a violation of the First Amendment because it's not the 10 Commandments sitting by themselves, indicating that those are the rules that the Texas legislature is going to follow. But the contextualization of the 10 Commandments among other monuments was an important aspect of that case. And we see the same thing around, say, holiday decorations. You can have a creche in a public space, but you're also likely to have nearby it, a menorah and other indications of other winter holidays going on at the same time.
We haven't talked much about freedom of the press. Where and in what ways is press freedom being challenged these days?
Yeah, so press freedom, we've seen a lot of controversial moves in that regard as well from this administration. Maybe the most high profile was when the Associated Press declined to refer to the Gulf of Mexico as the Gulf of America. The Trump administration excluded them from many events at the White House, a spot on Air Force One. The Trump administration is also assigning spots in the briefing room to news outlets that tend to provide more favorable coverage of him.
But they aren't necessarily blocking them from covering the White House. They're just making access much, much more difficult. There's a difference, isn't there?
There is a difference, and that is where this administration, I think, challenges a lot of the norms that we have, even if it's not an explicit violation of the law. The sort of tradition is that you provide equal access to everyone, regardless of their point of view. Here, when you have finite resources, there are only so many seats in the briefing room. Someone has to have control over who gets those seats. Prior administrations have left those decisions up to the press itself to decide who gets those seats. This administration decided, no, we're going to do it. And there's no rule necessarily that says who should be in charge of that. And so it's one of those sort of traditional lines that have not been crossed in the past, and this administration is not afraid of crossing those lines.
When there is some sort of conflict in our world, in America, we have a tendency to hear people say things like, I have a right to be here, to say that, to do that, and so forth. And they are often referring to their interpretation of the First Amendment. How often and in what ways do we tend to most often misinterpret the First Amendment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the most common misinterpretation is when you are objecting to the behavior of someone who is not a government official. So if I'm arguing with the owner of a business and they say, get off my premises, you're no longer welcome here. There are people who say, I have a First Amendment right to express my views. And you may have a First Amendment right to express your views that the government can't constrain. But the First Amendment does not have anything to say about what private individuals do with respect to speech and the rules that they lay down in their personal spaces. And I think one of the places where we see that particular distinction between government actors and non-government actors that's become quite controversial in the free speech context is internet platforms, and the question whether, given the dominance of very few large social media companies, should we limit the ways in which they can regulate and determine what speech goes on their platform, or should we not? And we're still in the context of sort of working out how we think that should operate.
Emily Berman is a professor of law at the University of Houston Law Center. Emily, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
And just ahead, how political and economic winds may be making it harder to advocate for fairness and access in public transportation. We discuss. Stay with us as Houston Matters continues. This is Houston Matters. I'm Craig Cohen. Like it or not, and we certainly hear from those who don't, Houston is a car-centric city. That doesn't mean that there isn't public transit here and that people aren't advocating for more of it and for that public transit to be more equitable for all of Greater Houston. That is the mission of the organization Link Houston, which last month welcomed Robin Holzer as its new executive director. She joins us now. Robin, good morning.
Good morning, Craig. Thanks for having us.
As we chat, we welcome questions or comments you have about public transportation in our region and really about transportation in general. We'll get to that in a moment as well. At talk@houstonmatters.org. You can call or text us at 713-440-8870. I want to point out right off the bat that you previously worked for Bike Houston, and so you've been in kind of surrounding this same area for a while now. But the goal of Link Houston is a little different from the goal of Bike Houston, right?
It's a little bit. The first I would say is I became an advocate for transportation that works for everybody 20 years ago. So it's not just recent, it's a long time. And I've supported public sector agencies, private sector consulting firms, and advocacy nonprofits and civic clubs and so on. I bring a perspective that I can see it from all sides.
What does Houston need more of in terms of public transportation?
Public engagement. That's not the answer you were looking for. A thing that happens in public policy is often our elected leaders only hear from a very vocal few. But what we know from large format surveys is lots of people in this region want more options. Like, who doesn't like having choices, right? And it's not just the people who don't have a lot of means. Everybody wants more choices. And the things that make those choices better for a few make those choices better for everybody.
I have floated in the past the observation that there's a chunk of the public out there that wants more choices in transportation, but doesn't actually want to use them themselves. That what they are interested in is seeing expansion of bus and light rail and varieties of other things. But when the time comes, they're not going to use it. They just want others to use it so that they've got more space on the road for themselves.
That's an interesting argument, Craig. I'm sure there is somebody who feels that way. They want it for other people. But better transit options are useful even in limited circumstances. Like if you're, for example, a household that only has one car may not need the bus every day, but they need the bus sometimes. You've got multiple adults or teenagers who need to get to soccer practice or piano lessons or what have you.
So in what ways is public transit here in Houston fair, and how is it unfair? When we talk about equity in public transit, what are we talking about?
Well, so a fundamental idea for Link, going back to 2017, is we envision a Houston in which anyone can be a first-class citizen without owning a car. That's the first part. The second part is that there are communities that don't always get a seat at the table. So since 2017, Link has been teaching community advocates, community leaders in neighborhoods across the city how to plug in with their elected leaders and with Metro and so on to participate in getting the kinds of transportation projects that make their lives easier and better.
Every year, your organization releases its Equity in Transit report. What does the 2025 report have to say, or has it come out yet?
It's not out yet, and I'd love for you to have me back in a month or so, and we'll give you more findings. But I can tease up what we've done. Okay. So this spring, volunteers and staff from Link Houston surveyed more than 300 daily bus and rail riders. We went out and canvassed at transit centers, and we talked to the people using transit to find out what matters to them, like what's good now and what can be better. Spoiler alert, almost half said that more frequent service is the thing they need most. Because when buses or trains come more often, you don't need a schedule. You can go out and know there's something coming. I can get on it and go and get where I need to go. Or if you miss the bus or you miss the train by a moment, there's another one coming sooner, which is great. Now, the cool thing is what the people say they want and what actually makes transit thrive in our region are the same thing. So Metro's own data about where they're gaining ridership shows that Metro gained riders last year. There are 7,000 more weekday riders this year than the year before. But 40% of that gain is on just the 7 routes that are running more frequently. That more frequent service is useful to more people, and then more people ride it, which is better for the people riding it. It's a wonderful, virtuous circle.
This is Houston Matters. I'm Craig Cohen. We're discussing public transit in Greater Houston with Robin Holzer, the new executive director of the organization Link Houston. We welcome you to the conversation at 713-440-8870 or talk@houstonmatters.org. I've said political and economic winds have been changing over the last year and a half in particular. Has advocating for equitable public transit here in Houston gotten harder?
It's gotten more important, probably more important than it's been in a long, long time. There's a thing that happens when, this has actually been true for a long time. The thing about some issues, if you were talking about cardiac issues or something, you'd think I need to talk to a cardiologist, right? But because everyone has lived daily experience with transportation, everyone feels like an expert in transportation. And that makes it real easy to listen to people who speak with confidence. But sometimes there's not pressure to listen to other voices. So the advocacy piece, where communities that need better options come together and can articulate that and tell their stories and share their data with their council people, with their county commissioners, with the Metro board, and so on, is really, really important. And it's especially important right now because the current administration has a fairly car-centric view of what makes a city strong. And it's very old school.
Does that mean, at least as long as that's where the political shift has gone, that transportation equity for the moment is over?
No, I wouldn't say that. Not at all. Because people like data and they like stories. And when you can marry a story with good data or a good story with data, it gets easier for decision makers to do the right thing. Like just in the last week, Link leaders sat down with Metro senior leaders, and we had a really productive conversation. Like, we have a seat at the table, and we talked about things they're working on, and we talked about things we're working on, and where those align. It's important for people to speak up.
Let's take some calls. Let's start with Jim. He's in the Heights. Jim, what's your question or comment?
Yes, I find that the buses here in Houston, you never know when they're going to arrive. And if you look at the schedules when they're supposed to be there, I grew up in San Antonio, and if the bus said it was going to be there at 8:17, if you were down the road a block away, you just missed it.
Right.
So in Houston, you can sit there, and people have gotten the app and said that doesn't work either because it says 15 minutes, it'll be there. 15 minutes comes and goes, and it just starts over again from what I understand. How you can run a transportation department when you never know when a bus is going to be there.
All right. Thanks for the call and for the comment, Robin.
That's a great comment, Jim. And actually, when we heard from a bunch of riders in our survey this spring, we heard that access to on-time data is really important. More than 90% of the people we surveyed use an app to figure out when they're going to get on their bus or their train. And the app has information, which is a good start, but it's really incomplete right now. And that's related to the whole tech stack, right? In order to have on-time bus data, there has to be a real-time GPS transponder on every bus. We're talking thousands of buses, and they all have to be working. So a thing we'll be advocating for coming up this summer, Metro is going to be putting together their budget for the next fiscal year. And over the next couple of months, they'll have meetings, they'll have a public hearing at the end of summer, and then they'll decide how to invest our transit dollars for the year ahead. If I want better data about buses, advocating for making sure that there's funding for the tech on every bus and every train, and that the apps have that data so that riders know when the bus is coming. It's really simple in some ways, but it's really important.
We're running a little short on time. I want to kind of combine some questions here. Julie's in the Galleria area and wants to know why there are no magnetic signs on the sides of buses that display the number. Can you speak to that briefly?
Oh, I can't speak to the magnetic signs, but something we heard last week from Metro CEO Tom Jason is that they have revised their specs for new buses to make sure that there are more numbers that show the bus route, not just on the front of buses, but on the backs of buses too. That's coming.
And Annette asks, will we ever have bike shares in Houston again? She says, I miss non-bike friends being able to go on rides with me on a whim.
I would say yes, absolutely. Every major city transit agency in the country has figured out that we have to marry walking and biking and transit together, that at the point at which people get out of their cars, they need all the options. Houston had bike share. Houston had bike share that was so successful that in some months it carried as many as 300,000 trips on bike share, which is more than like a quarter of Metro's lowest performing bus routes. Bike share is really important, even in Houston. And we were poised for Metro to take that on in September of 2023, but there was an election, the CEO resigned, new Metro board leadership, and that hasn't been a priority for them right now. But it is definitely something that we need and something that people can ask for and we can fight for.
Robin Holzer is the new executive director for Link Houston. Robin, thank you very much.
Thank you, Craig.
Still to come, intentional or not, some Houston area buildings, venues, and events may come off as more masculine or feminine. An interior designer explains how societal norms and psychology influence how men and women perceive spaces differently and how every design choice made in any location sends a signal. Stay with us as Houston Matters continues. Years ago, I accompanied my parents to a car dealership for an oil change. While waiting, my mom visited the restroom and emerged a few minutes later, frustrated. She told a manager she couldn't reach the hook high up on the women's restroom door to place her jacket and noted it must have been designed by a man. To the dealership's credit, they listened, and within days they'd repositioned the hook lower on the door. Not all superheroes wear capes. Now, it may have been an accident, an unconsciously ill-advised choice, but every design choice in every location conveys a message, and sometimes that message speaks more to men than it does to women, or vice versa. Veronica Clifton is the owner and principal designer of Houston-based R.J. Clifton Designs. She tells Houston Matters producer Brenda Valdivia how factors from societal norms to psychology and beyond can all influence how men and women perceive any space differently, but that, in her view anyway, Houston spaces by and large are fairly gender neutral.
I really don't see a lot of totally girly spaces. I don't see a lot of masculine spaces either. I think more than anything, I've seen a lot of cultural influence spaces, but I think there's space for gender-specific aesthetics because it brings about a client base. So if you have a super girly spot, like there is a spot in Rice Village, and I don't know if it's the same, Upper Kirby, and it is completely girly. I mean, even the stone on the bar is like pink blushes, and I was like, oh my gosh, this makes me feel like I need to put on the cutest dress and the cutest heels, not just regular heels, but like floral heels, and come in and strut. So I think there's a space for it, but as I've been a native Houstonian and as I think about some of the places I've been, I would say that either it's gender neutral or it needs design, like it has no design impact.
Yeah. Now, we have been called a city without boundaries, no zoning law city. You know, you'll find a tire yard next to an elementary school
Absolutely.
or something. Maybe not as egregious, but we have had that level of whatever we can build here, we'll build it.
It's the Wild Wild West.
Yeah.
That's what I like to call it.
What makes a space masculine or feminine? And is the conversation, I want it to feel masculine. I want it to feel feminine. I want it to feel gender neutral. Yes. Do those conversations happen?
Yes, those conversations happen in the very beginning. So I do a 15-minute discovery call, and that's when we have those conversations. And a lot of times, if we're dealing with a residential client, it will be whoever is that head decision maker. And most often it's women, but I always bring the husbands in if there's a husband. And a lot of times the husbands will like to hide in the shadow, or the wife will immediately say, oh, no, he already, gave me the reins and it's my project. And I'm like, no, I've experienced it. Husbands have opinions, and husbands don't want to live in a space where they feel like they can't see themselves. Or, design is, a lot of times it's known as, oh, don't touch it. It's just pretty. It's to be seen and not lived in. And that's not true. So I have to break that stigma in men. And I have to say, your input is important. You're going to sit on it. You're going to live in it. You're going to touch it. I need to know what you like. And so because I deal with that a lot with married couples, I find the happy medium. So that's why the gender neutral for me is very noticeable, because in a lot of our designs, we focus on that. In terms of, having that conversation, if it's a single male, of course, he's going to say he wants a space that feels and looks like him. So a lot of times what I go to, whether it's male or female, is their closet. And I say, let me see what your fashion looks like. And a lot of people, their aesthetic for their fashion is top tier. And I say, well, let's bring that into your interiors. That's what your interiors should look like. So if you love supple leathers or nubby ostrich tones, if you love those textures and those feels, we're going to bring that into your interiors. Because the segue between fashion and interiors is so tight. It's the lines are so blurred. And I love that about it. And so that's how we get into those conversations very early on.
I've often heard the term that men go with shapes and textures and women color. Is that true?
Well, I've never heard that, but I would think that that's true because men don't see color the way women do. There's scientific fact that the cones in the men's eyes are different. And so a lot of men will see grays and blacks and whites really well. So if you think about most color palettes for men, what do you see? Browns, grays, whites, blacks, right?
Warm and cools.
Warm and cools. That's by design, because that's what their eye gravitates to. Women see color very differently. We see color. And so I won't get into it because I learned it many, many years ago, and I'm forgetting all of the details of the science of it. But that's one thing that when I do work with male clients, I have to coach them on color more than I do my female clients, because they don't see it. And I had to learn that because it can be frustrating. And you're like, why you keep going to the grays, the blacks, the whites? It's just because it's what's in their nature. So I do very detailed consultations. And before we get to any type of design, we've had a 15-minute discovery call. We've had a 2-hour initial consultation. And then we have a process of where I put together a design, which takes about 4 to 6 weeks. So during that time, you're looking at over a course of 2 months maybe, where I'm asking the questions. You're telling me your wants and your needs. You're explaining to me the concept of the space. How do you want a person to feel in your space? So it's not an easy build out. It's not supposed to be an easy build out because, especially in commercial, even in residential, you're going to sit in this design for 15, sometimes 20 years before you change. Decorating is microwave popcorn. Design is to be savored. And so when you savor that experience, you want to make sure you get it right. You don't want stinky benches. So you have to think about, even if it's a sports bar, a person is going to sit and watch, 2 games? That's 4 hours of their life. My butt better feel good after those 4 hours.
Now, we've talked a lot about gender, feminine, masculine spaces. But of course, there's a lot of people who are non-binary. A lot of people don't think of spaces in terms of gender. And I don't want people to walk away being like, ew, this is how Brenda views the world. No, there's a lot of places that men and women mix together. How do I make sure that my restaurant or my living area is welcoming to all genders?
That's a good question. You have to be true to you. You have to know who you're servicing. So if it's your home, you have to know who's coming over. Know your family, know your friends. Far before you get to the aesthetics, though, you want to make sure that they're comfortable, right? You want to make sure that your furniture is functional. So many times people skimp on their interiors, even from just like, I'm going to Home Goods and I'm buying some new chairs. Okay, well, what do those chairs feel like? Are you going for something that's functional and that will last, or are you going for whatever fits your pocket? And usually you get what you pay for. If you jump into something that just fits your budget and your pocket, it may be uncomfortable and it may not last. So I would say always, number one, focus on the function and what you need for that furniture to do. And then from the aesthetic, have fun with it. Don't be boring. You can always close the door. Your front door is closed. So the person on the street should not care what your interiors look like. Have fun with your spaces. Source your closet. Source your brightest and best handbag and shoes. Talk to your kids. Kids are honest. Ask your kids, what would you see here? And then, of course, if they're going to say, I want it to look like my Barbie house, you know how to refine that, right? But your home is unique to you. Have fun with that. And, don't be so defined by trends and what people say design has to be. There, of course, are different principles that you want to hit with design. But other than that, you can have fun with it.
I have gone to houses where they're very well decorated, but there's a coldness to them. Mm-hmm. They feel manufactured. How can I make sure that the home I'm in and the home I'm creating isn't just something that's based on design and decor, but something that feels human and something feels like more personal?
You're right. Certain colors that you use in a hospital, you wouldn't use at home. I remember when grays were popular. I think it was like during COVID. Everybody wanted gray and white.
Millennial gray.
Oh, my God. But here's the thing. Nobody understood undertones of gray. Hospital use grays with cold undertones because it's a sterile feel, right? You don't need the depth of color. So you have a basic white and a basic gray. You don't want that in your home. It makes it feel sterile. So you want to make sure the undertones of a color, of your paint color, is warm. So there's grays. A gray that has a brown undertone, right? So that way you're still getting that gray color, but you're getting the warmth of it. And again, it's a whole science to color. And that's why I think it's very important for people to partner with professionals, color specialists. If you can find a designer like myself that is a color specialist, then you can maximize what that space is supposed to feel like. But a space is broken down into so many layers. It's more than what meets meets the eye. And that's why I love what I do as a designer, because I am giving my homeowners and commercial business owners an experience that goes far beneath, okay, I want it to look like this.
Veronica Clifton is the owner and principal designer of Houston-based R.J. Clifton Designs. She spoke with Houston Matters' Brenda Valdivia. And that'll do it for today's show. The Houston Matters team includes Michael Haggerty, Joshua Zinn, Brenda Valdivia, Mean-Show Jacob, and Laura Walker. Jared Carroll's our technical director. On tomorrow's show, more about protests. Also, some area congressional races take shape. We discuss those and other developments in this week's political roundup. Also, we remember the Galveston movement when 10,000 Russian Jews set sail not for New York, but bound for Texas. And a former Houston poet laureate and an HGO composer in residence collaborate on a new work we'll preview. I'm Craig Cohen. Join us tomorrow for those and other Houston Matters.